It was New York City, autumn of 2008. The financial world was burning. The stock market dropped like a broken elevator. Banks collapsed. People who had spent their lives chasing security woke up every morning to find it slipping through their fingers like sand. And in the middle of this chaos was David, a 38-year-old stockbroker who lived with his wife and 7-year-old son in Queens. From the outside, he looked like every other commuter in a pressed suit, carrying his briefcase with the tired dignity of a man who believed hard work would protect his family. But inside, David was unraveling. One gray Monday morning, his boss called him into the glass-walled office. No small talk, no kindness, just a single sheet of paper on the desk, a contract worth millions that David had failed to secure. The boss's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. "You've cost this firm money we cannot afford to lose. You'll take a pay cut, and if this happens again, you're out." David stood there, his face burning but his mouth frozen shut. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that no one could have saved the deal in this market. But fear wrapped around his throat. He thought of the mortgage, the school bills, the credit cards already maxed out. So he lowered his eyes, nodded, and walked out. By the time he reached the subway, his anger had hardened into a stone in his chest. That evening, he walked into his apartment. The smell of spaghetti sauce filled the kitchen. His wife looked up, smiling, ready to ask how his day had been, but David didn't answer. He muttered a half-hearted hello and dropped his jacket on the couch. Then it happened. His little boy, excited to see his dad, ran to the table with a glass of milk. Too fast, too clumsy. The glass tipped. White liquid spread across the wooden surface like a flood, and David exploded. "What's wrong with you? Can't you do anything right?" The boy froze, eyes wide, then burst into tears. His wife stood stunned, her spoon halfway to the pot. Before she could speak, their dog, an old golden retriever who had greeted David with wagging tail every day for 7 years, barked and circled his feet. Normally, David would scratch behind its ears, but not tonight. With the same anger that had no place to go at work, he shoved the dog with his foot, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to send it yelping into the hallway. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of a child sobbing. The very next morning, David stormed out of his apartment, still chewing on last night's bitterness. He was halfway down the steps when, splat! A pigeon overhead delivered its opinion of Wall Street directly onto his freshly pressed shirt. White, gooey, impossible to ignore. David froze, eyes wide, muttering words that would make a sailor blush. He yanked off his jacket, tried to wipe it clean, and in doing so, stepped straight into a puddle the size of New Jersey. His shoe made that awful squish sound, the kind that tells you your socks won't be dry until Thursday. By the time he staggered into the subway, dripping and smelling like a bird coop, a teenage kid pointed at him and laughed so hard he nearly dropped his skateboard. Even the subway announcer's voice seemed to mock him. "Stand clear of the closing doors, sir." David couldn't help it. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a loud, ridiculous laugh. The kind that bubbles up when you realize the universe just served you a pie to the face. And in that absurd moment, wet shoe, ruined suit, pigeon still circling overhead, he understood. Maybe last night he hadn't kicked a dog. Maybe he'd kicked his own karma straight into motion. On the subway ride home that evening, David replayed the comedy of errors in his head. The pigeon, the puddle, the kids' laughter. Each image felt like a slapstick sketch from an old Charlie Chaplin reel. For the first time in weeks, he laughed without bitterness. But when the laughter died down, something else crept in, an ache, quiet and steady. If the universe could humble him with bird droppings and puddles, what about the people who had borne the weight of his anger the night before? His son's tear-streaked face flashed in his mind, the startled yelp of the dog, his wife's silence at the dinner table. By the time he reached Queens, the city lights no longer looked sharp and unforgiving. They shimmered like mirrors, each one reflecting back a piece of himself he hadn't wanted to see. He opened the apartment door slowly. The smell of dinner lingered. Roast chicken this time. His son sat at the table, hunched over a coloring book, crayons scattered like fallen soldiers. The dog lay curled in the corner, head resting on its paws, watching warily. His wife moved quietly between stove and sink, her back to him. For a moment, David just stood there, coat still on, briefcase dangling, as if he were a guest in his own home. He took a deep breath, walked to the table, and lowered himself into the chair beside his boy. The child didn't look up. He pressed harder on the crayon, as if trying to fill the page fast enough to avoid his father's gaze. David's throat tightened. The same silence he'd once mistaken for strength now felt like a wall between him and everyone he loved. The stone in his chest cracked. He stood up, knelt beside his son, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Daddy was wrong. The boy looked up, still cautious, then slowly leaned into his father's arms. The dog padded over and rested its head on David's knee, as if to forgive him, too. From that night on, David and his family built what they called their safety valve. Every evening after dinner, they gathered for 5 minutes to share one good thing and one hard thing from the day. No interruptions, no judgment. It was simple. His son would talk about a tough math problem. His wife would mention a rude customer. And David, at last, would speak about the stress at work. Not with anger, but with honesty. That little ritual became their release valve, preventing pressure from exploding in the wrong direction. The house grew warmer, lighter. The boy stopped flinching when milk spilled. The dog wagged its tail without hesitation. And David, though still walking through the chaos of Wall Street, no longer carried the storm into his living room. Life will always hand us burdens too heavy to carry alone. Anger, fear, disappointment. They're part of being human. But where we place that weight matters. If we throw it downward, it crushes the ones we love. If we hold it inside, it poisons us slowly. The secret is to build a valve, to share, to breathe, to laugh, even when the world feels merciless. Because in the end, true strength isn't silence. It isn't pretending nothing hurts. True strength is knowing when to speak, when to soften, and when to turn a kick into a conversation. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's realizing that sometimes the universe sends a pigeon or a stranger's chuckle, not to punish us, but to remind us that kindness, like cruelty, always